The sun hung low over the Montana Badlands, painting the Absaroka foothills in shades of burnt orange, as Jeremiah Colton wiped sweat from his brow. The rhythmic thud of his splitting maul against pine logs still echoed in his ears when he saw her, a woman staggering through the sagebrush like a mirage. Her calico dress was caked with trail dust, the lace trim torn from what looked like weeks of hard travel. She clutched a leather pouch to her chest like it held the last gold nugget in Deadwood, but it was the wildness in her eyes that made Jeremiah drop his tool. "Mercy," she croaked, her voice raw as untanned hide, "just till sunrise." He stepped forward, spurs jingling faintly, his shadow stretching long across the prairie grass. "Sunrise," he agreed, then added with a twist of his mustache, "or till the next blue moon, whichever suits." The woman, Lillian Graves, as she'd later introduce herself, gave a humorless chuckle before her legs gave out. Jeremiah caught her with the ease of a man who'd roped runaway steers, carrying her into the cabin, where the smell of venison stew hung thick. He wrapped her in his late wife's Navajo blanket, the one traded for a silver concho belt back in '68, and watched as her fingers trembled around a tin cup of whiskey-laced coffee. Her pouch spilled open on the rough-hewn floor, revealing a daguerreotype of 2 tow-headed boys and a sheriff's badge with a bullet dent. "Where is this?" she rasped, eyes darting to the Winchester leaning by the door. 12 miles east of Bozeman," Jeremiah said, stirring the stew. "Closest lawman's a 3-day ride, if that's your concern." Lillian's knuckles went white around the cup. Not running from the law, running toward what's mine. The story unraveled like a spool of barbed wire, a dead husband in Dakota Territory, a brother-in-law with connections to the railroad barons, a courtroom in St. Louis where they'd called her hysterical for demanding her sons back. "Turns out," she said, biting off the words like tough jerky, "a woman's worth less than the dirt under a rich man's boots." Jeremiah spat into the fire, sending up a hiss of sparks. "Funny thing about dirt," he mused, "it remembers whose blood soaks into it." That night, when coyotes began their serenade, Jeremiah caught Lillian standing at the window, tracing the badge with her thumb. "You ever fire that Colt Navy on your hip?" he asked casually. Her answering smile could have curdled milk. "Only at men who mistake kindness for weakness." Come dawn, they'd find the brother-in-law's hired guns waiting by the creek, but that's a story for another campfire. For now, the stew pot hung between them like a promise, and Jeremiah knew some ghosts weren't meant to be left wandering. Lillian Graves woke before dawn, the scent of wood smoke and coffee pulling her from the kind of sleep she hadn't known in years. Outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood told her Jeremiah was already working. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, the rough planks cool under her feet, and watched as he swung the axe with the ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime bending the land to his will. Without a word, she picked up the second axe leaning against the rail and joined him. Jeremiah paused, wiped his brow with a bandana, and nodded toward the barn. "Cow could use milking if you're of a mind." By week's end, the cabin smelled of sourdough and dried sage, the floors swept clean, the windows washed until they gleamed. Lillian moved through the days like a woman rebuilding herself brick by brick, mending Jeremiah's shirts with stitches, neat as a surgeon's kneading bread dough, until her knuckles ached, always pausing when a rider passed on the distant trail. Jeremiah noticed. He noticed how she tucked the children's daguerreotype under her pillow at night, how her hands stilled at the sound of a whip-poor-will's call, the same bird that had sung outside her boy's window back in Dakota. On the 7th evening, he found her in the barn, her fingers working a needle through the torn sleeve of his only good shirt. The lantern light caught the gold in her hair, the stubborn set of her jaw. "You don't owe me labor," he said, leaning against the stall. She didn't look up. "Ain't about debt. It's about remembering how to be a person again." Jeremiah chewed the inside of his cheek. "You planning to stay then?" This time she met his gaze. The lantern flickered between them, casting shadows that danced like coyotes on the walls. "You meant what you said about staying." His voice was gravel rough. "A man doesn't offer his home lightly." Lillian's fingers brushed his callus against callus, and something unspoken passed between them. A promise, a reckoning. That night, by the fire's glow, she unfolded the daguerreotype. "Ethan turns 10 next month," she whispered. "Jacob's 8. Last I heard they were in St. Louis wearing silk vests and answering to another man's name." Jeremiah took the picture, his thumb tracing the boys' faces. "We'll find them." Her laugh was sharp brittle. "You don't even know them." "I know you," he said, and the way he said it, like a vow, like a gunshot in the dark, made her breath catch. She leaned into him, then her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as naturally as a key fits a lock. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming rain, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a wolf howled a sound that was neither threat nor warning, but simply the wild acknowledging its own. And in that moment, with the fire painting their faces gold, and the night stretching vast and untamed around them, the word love hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Not the soft, easy love of storybooks, but the hard, enduring kind, the kind that plants its feet in the dirt and dares the world to try and move it. Lillian stood at the fence line, the morning sun warming the back of Jeremiah's flannel shirt. She'd borrowed the fabric, still carrying the scent of wood smoke and saddle leather. The barn cat wound between her legs as she stared across the pasture, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, so strong it could wake the dead. Inside the cabin, Jeremiah watched her through the window as he sharpened his skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, keeping time with his thoughts. There was something about the way she stood, utterly still, yet vibrating with some unspoken tension, like a bowstring pulled taut. When he stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight, she didn't startle. Just turned her head slightly, her profile sharp against the sunrise. "This place," she said, voice low, "it's got its own heartbeat. Slow, steady, like it's never once hurried for anybody." Jeremiah leaned against the fence beside her, close enough to see the pulse at her throat. "Takes time to learn that rhythm again," he said. After living in a storm, she took a sip of coffee, her fingers tightening around the cup. "You ever make it into Bozeman?" "Only when the supplies run low. Why, I was handy with a needle once. Could earn my keep if there's work." His jaw worked. "You ain't a burden, Lillian." "I know," she said, but the set of her shoulders said otherwise. That afternoon, they rode into town together, Jeremiah on his buckskin gelding, Lillian atop the dun mare he'd borrowed from old man Fletcher down creek. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet two people share when words aren't necessary. She asked about the abandoned mine shaft. They passed the cluster of wild plum trees gone feral near the old stage road. He answered in grunts and nods, but his eyes kept drifting to the way the sunlight caught in her hair, turning it the color of wheat at harvest. Bozeman wasn't much a dusty main street lined with false front buildings, the air thick with the smell of horse manure and fresh-cut lumber. Folks noticed them, of course. A stranger riding beside Colton was news, especially one with eyes that missed nothing and a Colt strapped to her thigh like she knew how to use it. Inside, Millie's Dress Goods, Noskido the shopkeeper, a sharp-eyed woman with steel-gray hair pinned tight as a banker's ledger, looked Lillian up and down. "This one yours?" she asked Jeremiah. "No, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Just a neighbor." The woman hummed, skeptical. "You ever darned socks so thin they're more whole than wool?" Lillian's mouth quirked. "Once stitched up a man's leg with fishing line and a whiskey-steady hand. Reckon socks ain't much different." By sundown, she'd traded a day's mending for 2 yards of denim, a tin of buttons, and something far more valuable. But the first flicker of pride Jeremiah had seen in her since she'd stumbled onto his land. As they rode home, the setting sun painting the prairie gold, he caught her studying the horizon with new focus. Like maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe in tomorrow. Lillian emerged from the mercantile with color high in her cheeks, the afternoon sun catching the dust motes swirling around her like gold dust. Jeremiah leaned against the hitching post, a twig of bitterbrush between his teeth. "Millie says I can take in sewing every Thursday," she said, tucking a parcel of fabric under her arm. He nodded, spitting out the twig. "That's sit right with you." "Better than right," she admitted, and something in her voice made his chest tighten. They rode home with the wind at their backs, the horses picking their way along the familiar trail. At the river crossing, Lillian reined in her mare, watching the current swirl around the rocks. A V of geese arrowed overhead, their calls echoing across the water. "Back in Dakota," she said, her voice rough as unplaned wood. "I thought if I just held still long enough, the pain would pass me by like a train missing the station." Jeremiah stayed quiet, letting her words settle between them. "Turns out grief don't work that way. Running didn't help neither. But standing still after you've run—" She trailed off, her knuckles white on the reins. Jeremiah nudged his horse closer, reaching over to steady her mount as it sidestepped. His hand brushed her calloused skin against calloused skin and held just a heartbeat too long. "You ain't got to outrun nothing here," he said, his voice low as distant thunder. The river roared below them, carrying winter's meltdown toward some distant ocean. By the time they reached the homestead, the light had gone soft as worn flannel. Lillian slid from the saddle, running a hand down the mare's sweat-damp neck before turning toward the cabin. "I'm making molasses cornbread tonight," she announced. "If you've got the makings. Root cellar's deep," he warned, handing her a lantern. "Watch for spiders." She paused at the doorway, her face half in shadow. "Strange thing I ain't looked over my shoulder once today." Jeremiah stepped past her, the wood door groaning on its hinges. "Then I'd call that a damn good day." That evening they ate by firelight, the cornbread sweet and substantial as forgiveness. Lillian's quiet laugh when he reached for a third piece sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the hearth. Later, as she darned a tear in his work shirt, Jeremiah pulled a battered volume of Whitman from behind the flour sack. His voice rumbled through verses about grass and war and lost brothers while her needle flashed in the firelight. "You ever miss somebody so bad it near stops your heart?" she asked when he closed the book. "Every damn day," he said, thumbing the dog-eared page. "Brother died at Shiloh. Came west after. Buried him twice, once in Tennessee dirt, once in my head." Lillian's needle stilled. "I pray my boys remember my face, that they ain't calling some other woman Ma by now." Jeremiah set the book aside. "They'll remember. How can you know?" "Same way I know a branding iron leaves its mark," he said, holding her gaze. "That kind of love don't fade." She didn't weep, just set her jaw and kept stitching each pull of the thread, a silent promise. When Jeremiah rose to bank the fire, her voice stopped him. "Jeremiah." He turned. "I ain't leaving," she said, simple as sunrise. "Good," was all he answered, but the word carried the weight of a vow. Outside, the spring rains came gentle but insistent, soaking into the thirsty earth, washing the winter clean away. In the fire-lit cabin, two people who'd been lonely so long they'd forgotten how to name it sat close enough to share warmth, building something new from the wreckage of what they'd lost. When the last snowdrifts finally surrendered to the Montana sun, Lillian took to wearing her hair in a single thick braid tied with a strip of blue gingham paid for with her own earnings from Millie's shop. She'd claimed a patch of earth behind the barn, turning the stubborn soil with bare hands until her fingernails were permanently etched with dirt. Jeremiah said nothing, just left a new hoe leaning against the rain barrel one morning, its handle smoothed from years of use. He was repairing the north pasture fence when he saw her coming across the meadow at a near run, her skirts snapping like a banner in the wind. She thrust a creased envelope at him, her breath coming fast. "From St. Louis," she managed. Clara Mahoney, she was the housekeeper for that bastard brother-in-law of mine. The paper trembled in her hands. She says they sent my boys to live with some uncle outside Omaha, gave the address and everything. Jeremiah wiped his palms on his jeans before taking the letter. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and something achingly familiar, pressed wildflowers. You believe her? She remembered Ethan's stutter when he got nervous. Lillian whispered. How Jacob would hum in his sleep. Her thumb traced the delicate violet petals tucked into the fold. This was always his first spring offering to her. The hammer hung heavy in Jeremiah's belt as he studied the looping script. You fixing to go get them? Lillian's gaze drifted toward their cabin, its chimneys sending up steady smoke. Not yet. The words came out rough as unplaned wood. They deserve more than a mother who comes empty-handed. You've built... I need to build them a home first. She cut in, her voice cracking like thin ice. A real one, with curtains in the windows and enough stew in the pot that they'll never wonder where the next meal's coming from. That night, by the fire's glow, she spread a scrap of muslin across the table and began sketching with a charred stick. Jeremiah watched as lines became walls, a steep-pitched roof, a front porch wide enough for 3 chairs. See here. Her finger tapped the eastern-facing window. I want them to wake to sunlight on their faces, and that creak sound better than any lullaby. The days took on a new cadence after that. Lillian left the shutters open to let in the morning light. Jeremiah started whittling a set of wooden soldiers by lamplight. Come Sunday evenings, they'd take their plates outside, eating in companionable silence, as the coyotes began their evening song. When she handed him the wrapped bundle of lavender soap from town, Jeremiah actually flushed beneath his beard. Ain't had nothing but lye soap since '69, he muttered, turning the cake over in his hands like it was mined gold. I know, she said simply. The way she said it, like she knew every hard year etched into his skin, made his throat tight. The following week, they rode out to the Henderson place to barter for lumber. As they crossed the high meadow, a herd of pronghorn exploded from the sagebrush, their white rumps flashing like signal mirrors as they fled. Lillian reined in, watching them disappear over the ridge, run like the devil himself snapping at their heels, she murmured. Jeremiah adjusted his hat, squinting into the distance. Sometimes he is. The unspoken truth hung between them, that some creatures run because standing still means death, and others run because they've finally remembered how to stop. The silence stretched between them as the dust settled behind the fleeing antelope, Lillian's hands resting loose on the saddle horn. At the Henderson place, Jeremiah hefted pine planks onto the wagon, while Lillian sat with Mary Henderson on the porch swing, their heads bent over a patchwork quilt stretched between them. When he came to fetch her, he caught the tail end of their conversation, something about a child lost to scarlet fever, about how Mary still woke sometimes, thinking she heard laughter in the next room. The ride home was quiet, but for the creak of leather and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Mary's girl would have been 8 this spring, Lillian said at last. She told me it took 14 months before she could pack away the child's Sunday dress. Jeremiah guided the team around a washout, the wagon groaning. Grief's a poor guest, he muttered. Don't never know when to leave. Lillian's fingers tightened on the reins. It moves impermanent-like. Starts using your good china without asking. That evening, she didn't follow him inside, but stood at the pasture fence as the moon silvered the prairie grass. Jeremiah joined her close enough that their shadows merged on the ground. Thinking about your boys, he asked. Every minute. She admitted, her voice rough as a saw blade. Wondering if Ethan still sucks his thumb when he's tired. If Jacob's outgrown his fear of thunder. She turned to him suddenly, the moonlight catching the tracks of tears she wouldn't let fall. I need them to find me standing strong, Jeremiah. not some broken woman who let the world whip her. He studied her face, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and didn't hesitate. "You're the strongest thing on this land, Lillian Graves." Her breath hitched. "Not without you beside me." The night held its breath as Jeremiah reached out his calloused fingers, brushing the end of her braid where the blue gingham had frayed. "Ain't going nowhere," he said, simple as sunrise. She wove her fingers through his, their work-rough palms, fitting together like two pieces of the same puzzle. "I want to build that east-facing window," she whispered, "with your name burned into the lintel next to mine. No flowery declarations, no grand gestures, just the truth, plain and solid as the Montana dirt beneath their feet." Jeremiah leaned in until their foreheads touched, his breath warm on her lips. Come morning, we start cutting timber. The summer heat arrived like an uninvited preacher, relentless and dust-choked. Lillian began rising before dawn, her notebook filled with sketches of bunk beds and bookshelves, measurements scrawled in margins. Jeremiah didn't ask questions, just started milling cedar from the stand beyond the creek, the aromatic wood chips piling golden around his boots. She found him one evening in the barn's fading light shirt plastered to his back with sweat as he planed a board smooth. "Why cedar?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Jeremiah didn't pause his rhythmic strokes. "Won't rot when the spring floods come." He ran a hand along the grain. "Stands firm when the winds howl." The unspoken meaning hung between them. This house would last. Just like them. Outside, the first fireflies of the season blinked awake, tiny beacons in the gathering dark. Inside, the cabin pinned above the hearth with a rusted nail. Lillian's sketch of their future home fluttered in the breeze from the open window, a promise written in charcoal and hope. Lillian lifted a curl of cedar to her nose, breathing in its sharp, clean scent. "Smells like rain before it comes," she murmured, watching Jeremiah's hands guide the plane along the board with practiced strokes. "You done much building before?" "Helped raise my daddy's house back in Tennessee," he said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "Let me notch the porch beams when I turned 16, said, if I could drink whiskey like a man, I could work like one too." She ran her fingers along the wood's smooth surface. "Still standing, last I heard." He tapped the board against his boot, sending up a puff of sawdust. Though the whiskey part didn't take. A quiet laugh escaped her as she stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. "I ain't never built nothing meant to last." "You will." His voice carried the weight of bedrock. She reached for the board, her calloused fingers tracing the grain alongside his. "Show me what makes good lumber." Jeremiah guided her hand along the wood, their skin rough against the smooth cedar. "See these lines, straight as a rifle shot. No twists, no weak spots." His thumb brushed a knot. "This here'll hold firm if you treat it right." Lillian's breath hitched at his touch. "I want my boys to see I built this with my own 2 hands," she whispered. "Not just waited on fate to change." "They'll know," he said, his voice low. "Same way you know sunrise follows dark." At first light, they rode to the creek bed, filling the wagon with flat stones for the foundation. By noon, Lillian's dress clung to her back with sweat, her arms streaked with dirt. On the ride home, she leaned against the wagon's side, the wind cooling her skin as she asked, "You reckon I could teach Ethan to ride? Never had horses back in Missouri." Jeremiah flicked the reins. "That bay mare's already half yours. Listens to you better'n she does me." A smile flickered across Lillian's face, soft, surprised, like she'd forgotten the feel of joy. "I'll braid her a new halter," she said. "Something pretty with leather instead of rope." That evening, Jeremiah found her in the garden, her hands buried in the earth, between bean sprouts. A quiet hum rose from her throat, something broken but hopeful. He knelt beside her, the rich soil cool beneath his knees. "Heard from Clara again." She shook her head, dirt crumbling from her fingers. "Wrote her, though. Told her come first frost I'm riding for Nebraska. Told her, her voice caught. Told her my boys will have a home to come to. Jeremiah reached out, brushing a smudge from her cheek. Her skin was warm from the sun, alive under his touch. You took this land and made it breathe, Lillian. I thought I was just putting up walls against the wind. You planted roots, he said, deep enough to hold us all. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between their hands, under the smell of turned earth and cedar chips hanging thick in the air. Then she stood, offering him her palm. Come see where I marked out the cook stove. They walked back as dusk painted the prairie in violet and gold, their footsteps silent in the tall grass. Inside, Lillian unrolled her drawings, careful sketches of bunk beds and bookshelves, windows placed just so to catch the morning light. Her finger traced the outline of a wind chime by the door. My mama made one like this, she said softly. Said its song would always call me home. Jeremiah studied the plans, and her face the determined set of her jaw, the hope lighting her eyes. Outside, the first stars blinked awake over Montana, keeping watch over a house that was no longer just timber and nails, but a promise taking shape in the gathering dark. Jeremiah studied the drawings spread across the table, his work-roughened finger tracing the lines of the future bedroom. You've built this whole place in your head already, he murmured. Lillian's hand came to rest beside his charcoal stains still marking her knuckles. Not just in my head, she said quietly. In here. She tapped her chest where her heart beat steady beneath calico fabric. The lantern light caught the gold in his beard as he turned to her. Then let's make it real, he said, his voice gravel rough. You and me. Her fingers laced through his without hesitation, their calluses catching a language of their own, written in hard work and harder-won trust. Outside, the wind tested the shutters, but the cabin stood firm. They took to sitting on the porch after supper, Lillian's head finding its place against Jeremiah's shoulder as naturally as a key fits a lock. No words passed between them, just the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned the sound of each other's breathing. By August's end, the rhythm of hammer and saw had become the heartbeat of the homestead. Jeremiah's hands shaped the boys' room from raw timber, while Lillian lined the walls with muslin she'd dyed the color of sunset and sky. When he fitted the last pane of glass into the westward window, she stood behind him, arms crossed, watching sunlight spill across the floorboards like liquid gold. They'll sleep here, she whispered more to herself than to him. Wake to the sound of that creek singing. Jeremiah wiped his hands on his trousers. You think they'll take to the quiet? Never had much of it before, she said, taking the rag to polish the glass. But Kid always loved water sounds. Used to say the well pulley made music. He'll find new songs here, Jeremiah said, watching her face in the afternoon light. The room smelled of fresh-cut cedar and hope. Lillian ran her fingers along the windowsill, her touch reverent. Clara wrote back, she said after a moment. Says the boys are safe but restless. Ethan walks the fence line every morning like he's searching for something. Jeremiah leaned against the doorframe. Maybe he is. She closed her eyes. Lord, I hope he hasn't given up waiting. No tears fell. No comforting embrace was offered. Just the quiet certainty that passed between them, stronger than pity, deeper than words. In the days that followed, they prepared for the journey like soldiers readying for campaign. Jeremiah reforged the wagon's iron fittings, while Lillian stitched oilskin packs and smoked venison strips. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, he met her by the barn with a burlap-wrapped bundle. Figured they might want something to remember this place by, he said, handing it over. Inside lay two carved horses, one a rangy Mustang, the other a sturdy draft animal, their manes detailed with painstaking care. Lillian turned them in her hands, her throat tight. They'll treasure these, she managed, pressing the box to her chest like it held the world. Jeremiah's gaze held hers in the gathering dark. Just make sure they know they've got a stall waiting for the real thing. The first autumn wind stirred the cottonwoods as they stood there, the promise of reunion and homecoming hanging between them, not as a dream anymore, but as a destination, written in dust and determination. The morning they left for Nebraska, a thin mist clung to the foothills like smoke from a dying fire. Lillian stood by the wagon, her fingers twisting in the folds of her skirt. "You don't have to come," she said, not meeting Jeremiah's eyes. "It's a hard ride for something that ain't your fight." Jeremiah tossed the last bedroll into the wagon with more force than necessary. "Ain't about the ride," he said, buckling the harness with quick, sure movements. "Those boys need to see exactly who's standing behind their mama." Her breath hitched. "You think they'll see the way I look at you?" He cut in his voice, rough as unplaned wood. "And they'll know." The journey stretched 8 sun-baked days across the prairie. Lillian spoke little during the daylight hours, her knuckles white on the wagon bench. But when campfires burned low and coyotes sang in the dark, she'd lean into Jeremiah's solid warmth and whisper memories, how Ethan used to ask why the sky stayed blue, how Jacob would laugh until he hiccuped the way they'd curl together like puppies in sleep. They reached the Nebraska farmstead at twilight, the fields golden with late summer wheat. Clara, tall as a sunflower, with eyes that had seen too much, met them at the property line. "They're inside," she said simply. "Been watching the road all week." Lillian stepped down from the wagon like a woman walking to the gallows, her boots kicking up dust that hung in the still air. Jeremiah stayed by the horses, one hand resting on his Winchester, though he knew this battle required no bullets. The sounds that spilled from the open doorway, a gasp, a sob. The thunder of small feet hit him like a shotgun blast to the chest. He didn't move. Didn't need to. When Lillian emerged an hour later, Jacob clung to her skirt like a burr, while Ethan stood just behind, taller than she remembered, but with the same wary eyes. She reached for Jeremiah with a trembling hand. "This is the man who built your home," she said, her voice steady now. Ethan studied Jeremiah with the solemnity of a child who'd learned distrust too young. "You know how to fix a busted fence rail, son," Jeremiah said, squatting to meet the boy's gaze. "I can fix near anything that's worth saving." That night in Clara's spare room, the boys slept tangled in Lillian's arms for the first time in 3 long years. Jeremiah kept watch on the porch, the Nebraska stars burning holes in the sky above him. The return trip took longer with 4 in the wagon. Ethan rode shotgun beside Jeremiah, peppering him with questions about cattle brands and coyote calls. Jacob sat pressed against Lillian, counting jackrabbits and pointing out hawk nests. When their homestead finally came into view, the new addition solid against the endless sky, the creek flashing silver in the afternoon light, Lillian's breath left her in a rush. The boys exploded from the wagon like buckshot, testing every door, every step claiming their territory with whoops and laughter. Jeremiah came to stand beside Lillian as they watched their sons, hers, by blood his, by choice, explore the home they'd built together. Without a word, he took her hand, their calloused fingers intertwining as naturally as cottonwood roots finding water. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a red-tailed hawk circled on the thermals, its shadow passing over the land like a blessing. The boys discovered the carved horses waiting on their beds, the polished wood gleaming in the late afternoon light. Neither spoke, but Ethan tucked his Mustang into his pocket, while Jacob clutched the draft horse to his chest as they explored their new home. That evening, with the boys splashing at the water pump, Lillian leaned against the barn beside Jeremiah, watching the first stars appear. "They haven't let me out of their sight," she murmured, her voice thick. "Even in sleep, Jacob keeps a fistful of my skirt." Jeremiah's calloused hand found hers. They're home now. That kind of knowing don't fade. She turned to face him, the last light catching the silver in his beard. You didn't just give me shelter, Jeremiah Colton. You gave me back my life when I'd buried it. His thumb brushed her knuckles rough against rough. You rebuilt it yourself, darling. I just handed you the tools. She pressed her forehead to his chest, breathing in the scent of hay and honest sweat. I love you, she said, simple as sunrise. His lips touched her temple, gentle as a falling leaf. You're my heart's address. They married in October, beneath a sky so clear the Absarokas seemed close enough to touch. Clara stood witness alongside Mary Henderson, her quilt draped over her arm like a banner. The boys flanked Jeremiah, their Sunday boots polished to a shine, while the creek sang its approval behind them. No preacher needed just two promises, spoken plain and true, sealed with a kiss that tasted of hope and homecoming. Winter transformed the cabin in ways the new walls couldn't measure. Ethan's boots lined up by the hearth, Jacob's laughter ringing from the loft, and the quiet nighttime sound of two people reaching for each other in the dark. Jeremiah built a table long enough for four, its surface sanded smooth as riverstone. Lillian taught Jacob to sew a straight seam, while Jeremiah showed Ethan how to read the land like a book, where the deer crossed at dawn, how to spot a loose fence wire before it broke. Come spring, they planted a garden that would make Clara proud, strung chicken wire with military precision, and carved a bench beneath the cottonwoods where they'd watch the sunset together. And each night, when the stars emerged like scattered grain across the Montana sky, Lillian would rest her head against Jeremiah's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of her son's breathing nearby, and know without doubt, without fear, that every hard mile, every lonely night, every tear shed into Missouri dirt had led her here, to this man, these boys, this life. Not a dream anymore, but something real as the earth beneath her feet, hers to hold, to tend, to cherish. Forever.